Bruce Ismay is among the most easily recognisable figures of the Titanic disaster. This is because he was the chairman and managing director of the famous White Star Line. He is even more recognised due to the tremendous amount of character assassination that he was subjected to in the yellow press following the sinking, building a negative caricature of the actual man. This is the true story of the so-called coward of the Titanic, Ismay, the story behind the chairman. Joseph Bruce Ismay was born on the 12th of December 1862 to Thomas Henry Ismay and Margaret Ismay at the Ismay family home named Enfield House in Great Crosby near Liverpool. Bruce's father Thomas has been described as the greatest shipowner of the Victorian era. He was a bright and intelligent businessman born in 1837. Thomas Henry Ismay had a good education at the Croft House School in Brampton. After only 1 year at Croft House, Thomas's father died suddenly, aged only 46. That meant that he was taken under the wing of his great-uncle, Isaac Middleton, and he arranged an apprenticeship for Thomas at the shipbrokers' firm named Imrie and Tomlinson, which was Uncle Isaac's own agent. So when Thomas was 16, he joined the company at their Liverpool office. Whilst serving the firm, Thomas developed a good reputation with the Liverpool merchants, due to the efficient attention he gave their business affairs. At 20 years of age, Thomas had already become a very astute businessman, and he was ready to make his mark. After a failed partnership with Nelson and Company, Thomas founded the T.H. Ismay and Company in early 1862 at 25 years of age. Thomas met Margaret, the eldest daughter of shipowners Luke and Mary Bruce. They fell in love almost immediately and married on April 7, 1859 in Liverpool. Thomas and Margaret were blessed with 5 daughters and 4 sons. Their eldest son, Joseph Bruce Ismay, was destined to succeed his father as the head of the White Star Line. In 1867, Thomas Henry Ismay purchased the White Star Line, an at the time bankrupted shipping line that was founded to transport Australian gold back to the United Kingdom, from the only remaining partner, Mr. Henry Wilson, for £1,000. Thomas Henry Ismay introduced his own iron ships from other shipping lines he owned to the Australian and New Zealand trade. After 2 uneventful years, Thomas was invited to dine with a man named Gustav Christian Schwabe, who was a prominent merchant in Liverpool. After dinner, Schwabe made an important business proposition to Thomas. Mr. Schwabe explained that his nephew, Gustav Wolff, had recently entered into a partnership with a certain Edward Harland in a shipbuilding enterprise in the city of Belfast. Due to the fact that the newly formed partnership had recently built some iron ships of a revolutionary design, Mr. Schwabe offered Ismay his large share in the shipyard, with the promise that the White Star Line would have all their ships built at Harland and Wolff. Mr. Ismay accepted the business proposal. So, in 1869, the Oceanic Steam Navigation Company was formed, with a capital of £400,000, of which Thomas subscribed a large percentage. Harland and Wolff were immediately commissioned to build 4 ships, to be known as the Oceanic-class liners, the first of which was Oceanic, followed by the Atlantic, Baltic, and Republic. With the appearance of Oceanic in the Mersey, the old liners looked outdated, and the new ships were long and narrow, appearing more like a yacht, and other companies had to take countermeasures to keep up with the White Star Line. In 1872, the SS Adriatic won the Blue Ribbon for the fastest westbound voyage, and in 1873 the SS Baltic won the Blue Ribbon for the fastest eastbound voyage. Thomas had set new standards for ocean liners, and under his control, the company was set to become a world leader. The first 2 years of the Oceanic Steam Navigation Company remained uneventful, only with a few minor incidents. However, this lasted until the 1st of April 1873. On the 19th voyage of the SS Atlantic under command of Captain James Agnew Williams, the ship struck Golden Rule Rock near Halifax during a heavy storm. The Atlantic's chief engineer John Foxley underestimated the coal supply of the Atlantic, which led to the decision to have the ship resupplied in the port of Halifax. The ship began to capsize and sank in less than 15 minutes and took an estimated 565 of the 952 people on board to their deaths. Shockingly, except for one young boy, all the women and children were lost. In the meanwhile, Bruce spent his childhood in Liverpool and was educated at the Elstree School in North London and the Harrow School from 1877 to 1878. Bruce was very attached to his mother and was very shy and extremely sensitive, which didn't make him happy during his school days. Bruce began to put on a defensive facade of brusqueness to make sure he didn't appear sensitive, which caused a lot of people to dislike him until they knew him better. Despite being devoted to both of his parents, his father found him difficult due to Bruce being quick-thinking compared to himself. After leaving Harrow, 16-year-old Bruce would have his education in Dinard, France, a fashionable French resort frequented by wealthy English and American tourists. While Bruce was studying in Dinard, he learned to play tennis, which he would continue to play for many years. When Bruce was 17, he returned back to Liverpool and began his apprenticeship at the head office of the White Star Line. While years before, Bruce had occasionally accompanied his father to his offices in the summer, and he would hang his overcoat and hat in his father's office. Bruce did just that after he received instructions, but left his coat and hat in his father's office as usual. Bruce's father ordered one of his clerks to please inform the new office boy that he is not to leave his hat and coat lying about my office. This snub was so humiliating that Bruce rarely wore an overcoat ever again. The problem for Thomas was that while he did not want to share in his son's company, he did want him to be involved in the family firm. In 1884, to achieve both ends, he sent 21-year-old Bruce to New Zealand aboard the newest White Star liner, the SS Doric. This was a luxury voyage rather than an adventure of the sort for Bruce, however. The point of the journey was not to test Ismay's mettle as a seaman, but for him to see how the new service on board the ship was working, and he was treated throughout with wariness and respect due to being the son of the owner. On his return to the United Kingdom 9 months later, the position of manager of the White Star Line agency in New York became vacant, and Thomas Ismay arranged that Bruce be given the job. An adult Bruce now stood at a tall 6'4" in height, with brown hair and brown eyes, as well as a sporting moustache. He completed his training in February of 1887 and replaced the existing White Star agent, becoming the youngest agent to represent a major shipping company. 3 weeks after Bruce took up his new post, he was confronted by his first maritime disaster. The SS Celtic and the SS Britannic, one on her way to Liverpool, the other on her way back, collided with one another in poor weather and were badly damaged. 3 steerage passengers were killed and 9 other passengers were injured. An inquiry into the collision was held in New York, and the captains of both ships were severely reprimanded for travelling at excessive speeds. Bruce, as the representative of the White Star Line, was expected to issue the American press with information. However, this was a job which was not suitable for young Bruce, since he had never mastered the art of public speaking or self-presentation. Bruce had a brusque, abrupt and imperious manner, and journalists saw him as rude, arrogant and charmless. He became famous amongst reporters in both the United Kingdom and the United States for what the financier called his enigmatic non-answers. However, no one disliked Bruce Ismay as much as the media baron, William Randolph Hearst. While serving as the manager of the White Star Line agency in New York, Bruce had finally escaped from the strict discipline and somewhat oppressive atmosphere of his father. While living in New York, Bruce met Harold Sanderson, the eldest son of Richard Sanderson, who ran a shipping agency. Bruce also met Miss Julia Florence Schiefling, born in 1867, the eldest daughter of the late George Richard Schiefling, who was a member of one of the oldest and most respected families in New York, as well as being a prominent lawyer. After a while, Bruce and Julia became unofficially engaged, which her father George was not very pleased with. Mr. Schiefling thought that Bruce was too devoted to his fiancée and thought that they would move to the United Kingdom. Both the Ismay and Schieffelin families agreed that it would be good to wait one more year to marry. By April of 1888, Mr. Schieffelin finally gave his consent. However, it was on the grounds that Bruce promised to keep Julia in the United States. The couple married on the 4th of December 1888 at the Church of Heavenly Rest. The Ismay family were very curious to meet Julia, and from the very first moment they met, they loved her elegant American clothes, accent, and lack of formality. The Ismays were personally invited to visit by Edward Harland. The occasion of the invite was to witness the launch of the Titanic on the 19th of January 1889. The ship entered service later that year on the 25th of July 1889. Bruce and Julia were photographed on the first-class staircase of the Titanic. Julia at the time was pregnant with the couple's first child, and the couple would welcome their first child, Margaret Bruce Ismay, on the 29th of December 1889. In September 1890, Bruce's father was considering retiring from the company, but wanted to remain involved as its chairman, and suggested to Bruce that he become a partner of the White Star Line, along with his younger brother James. The offer, however, was contingent on Bruce's return to England. Should he turn it down, the position instead would go to James. Bruce, who resented the idea of being overtaken by a preferred brother with no particular interest in ships and none of his own experience, had little choice. Bruce was caught between the demands of his own father and the promise he had made to his father-in-law to keep Julia in the States, but Thomas's doubtlessness made the difference, and reluctantly George Schieffelin released his son-in-law from his bond. On the 3rd of April 1891, Julia and Bruce welcomed their second child and first son, named Henry Bruce Ismay. Ismay was officially made partner in the firm of Ismay, Imrie and Company in 1891. As partner, it was Bruce's suggestion that Harold Sanderson take the job of general manager of the White Star Line in Liverpool. With Sanderson on board, Bruce would have a colleague with whom he could relate. Sadly, in 1893, the White Star Line had their second loss under the company's flag. On the 11th of February 1893, the company's largest livestock carrier, the SS Narrator, left Liverpool and was never seen again. She went down in the North Atlantic with her entire complement of 24 passengers and her 58 crew members. Even after an inquiry into her loss and the discovery of a few of her lifeboats, it still remains a mystery what happened to her. On the 18th of February, Julia and Bruce welcomed their second son, named Thomas Bruce Ismay, and on the 17th of June 1897, they welcomed their second daughter, Evelyn Constance Ismay. In 1896, the White Star Line experimented a new strategy with the earlier built SS Cymric, called Luxury over Speed. This strategy proved to both Holland and Wolff and the White Star Liners that her enlarged passenger capacity, 258 first and 1,160 third-class passengers in total, and cargo capacity, between 6,996 to 8,123 tons of cargo per voyage, were more profitable than if spaces were used for the boiler and engine rooms. For many years, the White Star Line was working on a new ship. The White Star Line had given orders to proceed to William Pirrie, the now head of Harland and Wolff, since Edward Harland had passed away in 1895. This ship was to be called the RMS Titanic, in honour of the company's first ship. She was contracted in February 1897 and her keel was laid on the 18th of March on slipway number 2. The Oceanic was 705 feet and 6 inches in length, with a moulded breadth of 68 feet, which made her the largest ship in the world at the time in length. Thomas Henry Ismay had been in good health for almost all his life, but by the beginning of 1899, shortly after Oceanic was launched, he began to suffer from pains in his chest. His condition slowly deteriorated and construction on Oceanic's sister ship was delayed. In March of that year, Ismay's health began to improve, and he and Margaret went to Windermere, where he became sick again. His wife summoned a doctor and a dose of morphine was given to Ismay. After 6 days, he was feeling better and he returned to Dorpool in Thurstaston. Within 6 weeks, he had more violent pain, and the doctor diagnosed this as a gallstone. By the 26th of April, Ismay felt good enough to work, but in August he collapsed and was confined to bed. On the 31st of August, an operation was performed to alleviate his condition. The operation was unsuccessful, and a second became necessary on the 4th of September. The next morning he insisted that his daughters go on the maiden voyage of the Oceanic, whilst he talked to his wife. He asked his wife to arrange for the local church to pray for him. On the 14th of September he suffered a heart attack. His condition continued to worsen, and on the 23rd of November 1899 he died at the age of 62. Following his father's death, Bruce Ismay took the helm of the White Star Line, helped by his brother and other partners of the firm. Bruce always insisted on punctuality, especially within the office, something he had inherited from his father. His office staff were much more aware of this, and on arriving for an appointment with him, they would stand outside the office door, waiting to knock at the exact appointed time. Bruce continued disliking any contact with the press. If a reporter approached him directly, he would usually remind them that the White Star Line had a helpful publicity department. In 1901, the White Star Line was approached by American interests for forming an international conglomerate of shipping companies named the International Mercantile Marine Company. The IMMC was under the ownership of the financier and investment banker John Pierpont Morgan, whose intention it was at the time to monopolise the shipping trade. The IMMC had already acquired the American Line, the Inman Line, the Atlantic Transport Line and the Red Star Line, and now had its sights set on more lines found in Europe. In 1902, Morgan approached the board of directors and proposed that he would pay the 75 shareholders 10 times the value of the line's earnings as they were in 1900. The sale would mean that the shareholders would make a considerable profit on their original holdings. The sale also proposed that Bruce would continue as chairman while the other partners of the firm would retire. The board of directors refused the offer at first. However, after multiple meetings, an agreement was formed with Mr. Morgan. Lord Pirrie, who was one of the most important shareholders of the White Star Line, expected that the acquisition of the White Star Line into the IMMC would have a positive effect for his shipyard to make arrangements that ships owned by the IMMC would only be built at Harland and Wolff. Bruce arranged the retirement for the partners of the White Star Line, including his younger brother James. The only partner remaining was Bruce's good friend Harold Sanderson. The White Star Line was sold in December 1902, and the company was now owned by the International Mercantile Marine Company. In the meanwhile, on the 6th of June 1902, Julia gave birth to their youngest child and son, named George Bruce Ismay. After a year, the president of the IMMC, Clement Griscom, was in poor health and nearing retirement, and Morgan felt that Bruce would be the ideal man to replace him as president of the IMMC. The idea did not appeal to Bruce, as he felt that the position would interfere too much with his private life. After much consideration and advice from his family, friends and business acquaintances, J. Bruce Ismay accepted the offer of presidency of the IMMC with a remuneration of $50,000 per annum. The White Star Line had its glory days with the completion of the first 3 liners of the Big Four class of ships. The project was followed by the Cedric, which was launched on the 21st of August 1902 and made her maiden voyage on the 11th of February 1903. At the time she was launched, she was the biggest moving object ever built, at 21,035 gross registered tons. The project was followed by the Baltic, which was launched on the 21st of November 1903 and made her maiden voyage on the 29th of June 1904. She was the largest ship in the world at 23,876 gross registered tons until 1905. The popularity of White Star's Big Four was eventually overtaken by Cunard's Lusitania and Mauretania. On one evening in the summer of 1906, Bruce and his wife dined at Downshire House in Belgravia, which was one of the many mansions owned by Lord William Pirrie. The Cunard Line, who currently remains the largest British competitor of the White Star Line, were building 2 large liners which could eliminate the dominance of the sea of the International Mercantile Marine Company. These 2 liners were to be called the Mauretania and the Lusitania. These 2 ships would not only exceed any ship in the world in terms of size, with the Mauretania being 790 feet in length and 31,938 tons in gross tonnage, and with the Lusitania being 787 feet in length and 31,550 tons in gross tonnage. But they would also exceed any ship at the time in terms of speed. After dinner, Bruce and Peary came up with the idea to build 2 larger liners, with a possible 3rd liner as an option if they were proven to be successful. These ships were to be named the Olympic and the Titanic. On the 30th of April 1907, 20 days after the passing of Bruce's mother Margaret, the order came in to start the designing of this new class of ships. It was also around the same time when Holland and Wolff started to rebuild their North Yard by demolishing the number 1, 2, 3 and 4 slipways to build an enormous gantry designed by Sir William Arrol and Company. Charged with designing this new class was Lord Peary, Alexander Carlisle, Holland and Wolff's chief designer and general manager, Lord Peary's nephew, Thomas Andrews Jr., who at the time was the assistant chief designer, managing director of design and manager of the construction works, and Edward Wilding, Andrews' deputy in charge of the complicated calculations, with Bruce having the final say. The drawing offices of Holland and Wolff would design a few general arrangement plans based on the requests and requirements of the White Star Line. Bruce stated that he did not want to comment on the specific plans beyond saying that the new ship's accommodation would be far ahead of anything that had yet been projected. On the 29th of July, the designs were presented to Mr. Ismay, along with his fellow directors Mr. Sanderson and the other directors of the board. The board of directors picked Design D. Design D envisioned a ship that was 850 feet in length between the perpendiculars, 92 feet in width, and 64 feet and 6 inches from the keel to the height of the shelter deck, sea deck. Design D had 29 Scotch boilers, 24 double-ended boilers with 6 furnaces each, and 5 single-ended boilers with 3 furnaces each. The 29 Scotch boilers would power 2 large triple-expansion reciprocating engines, as well as a lower-pressure turbine engine, which wasn't implemented on any White Star liner at that time. The engines would power a triple-screw arrangement, which would give the ship a cruising speed of 21 knots. Design D had 4 funnels, of which 3 were functioning as exhaust of the boiler rooms. On the 31st of July, the letters of agreement were signed to proceed with the construction of the Olympic-class liners. On the 16th of December 1908, the keel of the Olympic was laid down on slipway number 2 of the new gantry. The keel of the Olympic was soon followed by the keel of the Titanic, which was laid in slipway number 3 on the 22nd of March 1909. Bruce oversaw the construction of the Titanic and Olympic with other White Star Line directors at Holland and Wolff, and requested any changes on behalf of the company regarding the accommodations on board. One of those requests was the addition of an aft mast to the Olympic-class liners. Every few months there was a meeting between Lord Peary, Alexander Carlisle, Harold Sanderson and Bruce at the White Star Line offices in either Liverpool or London to discuss her interior fittings, her safety features and more matters regarding the design. The Olympic-class liners were to be divided into 16 watertight compartments by 15 watertight bulkheads, and it was designed to stay afloat with any 2 compartments flooded. The Olympic-class liners could even stay afloat with all 3 of her forward compartments flooded. In building the Olympic-class liners, it was the hope of Bruce and the board of directors to build a class that couldn't be destroyed by the perils of the sea or the dangers of navigation. Alexander Carlisle strongly advocated for more lifeboats on board the Olympic-class liners due to the fact that the laws and regulations of the Board of Trade, which required ships of more than 10,000 tons in gross tonnage to have a minimum of 16 lifeboats, were getting outdated due to the fact that ships were growing increasingly larger in size. When Bruce disagreed with Mr. Carlisle, his opinions purely due to aesthetic reasons, He still approved the new davits from the Whale Davit Company from Sweden, which were designed specifically for the Olympic-class liners, in case the regulations would change. This would mean that in the event of a regulation change, there wouldn't be too many changes needed for Olympic-class liners to accommodate more lifeboats. Carlisle would retire from Harland & Wolff in June 1910 due to his declining health, and he would be succeeded as chief designer by Thomas Andrews Jr. In January 1909, the unthinkable happened when the RMS Republic had a severe collision off Nantucket with the SS Florida while in fog. The Republic was mortally struck on her port side, and 3 people were killed in the collision on each of the ship. The bow of the Florida was crushed for about 30 feet in length, but could stay afloat. A distress call was sent out by the wireless operator Jack Binns, and everyone outside those who were killed during the collision was saved by the RMS Baltic. The ship took nearly 39 hours to sink, and the sinking bolstered the trust in the safety of shipping. In 1910, a small problem was noticed that needed a solution months before the Olympic was launched. For the Olympic class, new tenders for the Cherbourg service were needed, as the 150 feet long tender SS Gallic, which wasn't built at Harland & Wolff but at John Scott & Company, was considered too small for the increasing passenger traffic in Cherbourg and was needed to be replaced. And as a reaction, the White Star Line ordered the construction of the tenders on the 25th of June 1910. These 2 tenders were designed by Thomas Andrews Jr. and were to be named the Nomadic and the Traffic. On the 20th of October 1910, Bruce and his family attended the launch of the Olympic. There was a huge list of dignitaries, such as the daughter of the Prime Minister Herbert Asquith, Violet Bonham Carter, Lord and Lady Aberdeen, who was the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, and his wife, the Lord Mayor of Belfast, Robert James McMurdy, and his wife, the Lady Mayoress of Belfast, and John Pierpont Morgan himself. Witnessed by an estimated 100,000 people, it took the hull, which was now the largest moving object made by man, just 62 seconds to slide into the Belfast loft from slipway number 2. The fitting out process of the Olympic could now begin. The 31st of May 1911 was perhaps the best day in White Star Line history. The Olympic would be delivered to the White Star Line, and the hull of the Titanic was launched from slipway number 3. Just as with the Olympic, the launch of the Titanic was witnessed by an estimated 100,000 people. After Titanic's hull was launched, a large group of dignitaries was brought towards the Olympic with a new tender Nomadic. On the same day, the Olympic started her delivery voyage to Liverpool at 4:30 p.m. The ship would briefly visit her port of registry. The Olympic arrived in Liverpool on the 1st of June and was anchored in the River Mersey to be opened for public inspections. Ismay and his wife disembarked in Liverpool, and they would go to Southampton later that month to join the Olympic on her maiden voyage. At 11:15 that evening, the ship sailed for Southampton and arrived there in the early hours of the 3rd of June. While in Southampton, the Olympic was prepared for her scheduled maiden voyage on the 14th of June. Bruce, his wife Julia, his secretary Mr. Harrison, his manservant Mr. Fry, and Mrs. Ismay's maid, Miss Mary Atwell, would travel on board the Olympic during her maiden voyage. Bruce would observe the Olympic in practice and would write notes and requested alterations for the Titanic. Also on board was Thomas Andrews Jr., who just as Bruce observed the Olympic in service. Among the most remarkable improvements noted by Ismay were the most popular room on board was the first-class reception room, which is why Ismay ordered 50 additional cane chairs and 10 tables for this room. Ismay also wrote to Harland & Wolff that the promenade space was resulted to be excessive, saying that in the Titanic it should carry extra rooms on B deck. Bruce was very satisfied with the Olympic's performance, and upon arriving in New York, Bruce wrote the following letter to the White Star Line offices in Liverpool. Despite experiencing the golden days in the company's history, Bruce slowly began to extricate himself from the role of president of the International Mercantile Marine Company. In January 1912, he wrote to his good friend and Vice President Harold Sanderson that he was prepared to step down as the president for him to take over. Bruce was planning to maintain the position until the 31st of December 1912. The date later moved to the 30th of June 1913. On the 21st of March 1912, almost 3 years after the Titanic's keel got laid down on slipway number 3, Mr. Ismay's oldest daughter Margaret married George Ronald Hamilton Sheep, who was a high-ranking officer in the British Army in London. Mr. Ismay and his wife stayed with the couple while the Titanic's sea trials commenced on the 2nd of April 1912. Representing the White Star Line during the Titanic's sea trials was Bruce's close friend and loyal general manager Harold Sanderson, while Holland and Wolfe was being represented by Thomas Andrews Jr. The Titanic started her delivery voyage that same evening and arrived in Southampton in the early hours of the 4th of April. Titanic was advertised to depart Southampton on Wednesday the 10th of April. Bruce Ismay and his wife drove down from their London home, accompanied by 3 of their children, Tom, Evelyn and George. As with many Titanic passengers, they stayed the night at Southampton's South Western Hotel. While previously on board the sister ship Olympic, Bruce had noted several points of improvement which were incorporated into Titanic's design. He was now looking forward to seeing how popular they would prove to be. Despite originally having booked C-62, fitted out in the Louis XIV style, Bruce discovered to his surprise that Mr. and Mrs. Henry Clack Frick had cancelled their booking of the parlour suite B-52, fitted out in the Louis XVI style, B-54, fitted out in the Empire style, and B-55, fitted out in the Holland and Wolfe bedroom A style with a private promenade. Mr. Ismay decided to take that suite instead. It being the Easter holidays, it was decided that Bruce would sail alone. Julia felt, as her husband was sailing to New York, then returning soon afterward, she would spend some time with their children on a yachting holiday. Bruce, Julia and their 3 children boarded the Titanic on the 10th of April at 9:30 a.m. to see at first hand the opulence of the ship. Once they had looked around, they returned to the dockside to see the magnificent ship depart. At 12 noon, the Titanic left Southampton, beginning her maiden voyage to New York. But her departure was not without incident. As the ship was increasing speed, the suction from the propellers was becoming greater. At that moment, Titanic passed the New York, the force being so great that the New York's moorings broke, causing the ship to drift out to the Titanic's path. Only the quick thinking of the master of the tug, Vulcan, prevented a collision. The prompt action of those on board Titanic also helped as the order "full astern" was given and the starboard anchor was lowered as a precaution. A collision was avoided, but only by a couple of feet. Titanic entered and crossed the English Channel without further incident, arriving at Cherbourg, France about 6.5 hours later, where she took on board more passengers and mail, which were delivered by the tender ship SS Nomadic and SS Traffic. At around 8 p.m, the mighty vessel left Cherbourg and headed for Queenstown Island, arriving at 11:30 the following morning, again taking on more passengers and mail. While at Queenstown, Chief Officer Bell was invited to Bruce Ismay's cabin to discuss the expected coal consumption for the voyage. Bruce's wish was for the coal to be conserved and the ship was not to be forced. However, they did agree that if Captain Smith approved and the weather conditions were favourable, a speed trial should be conducted during the afternoon of the following Monday or Tuesday. 2 hours after arriving in Queenstown, the world's largest vessel departed for New York. Titanic began her Atlantic crossing, carrying 2,208 passengers and crew. Passengers on board were settling in, with those of all 3 classes enjoying life on the magnificent ship, as she steamed to New York at an average speed of 21 knots. On Saturday the 13th, first-class passenger Mrs. Lynes had just finished luncheon in the first-class dining room on D-deck, and she took a seat in the adjoining reception room. After she had taken a seat, Captain Smith and Bruce Ismay came in and sat at a table nearby and began discussing the possibility of having the last boilers lit. Mrs. Lynes stated that she overheard the conversation, describing that she heard Ismay saying, "We will beat the Olympic and get into New York on Tuesday." When she was asked to describe the appearance of Smith and Ismay, she was unable to describe either of the men, although Mrs. Lyons stated that she had previously seen Bruce Ismay while he was living in New York 13 years earlier. Mrs. Lyons' inability to describe Smith and Ismay may have been due to the fact that she gave her testimony 18 months after the disaster. Meanwhile, the Titanic steamed across the Atlantic using the southern track. This was the appropriate course for ships crossing the Atlantic between the months of January to July. The southern track is considered to be much safer because the ice floes travelling down the Labrador Current would normally break up in the Gulf Stream. This particular year saw an exceptional amount of ice travelling along the Labrador Current. The Arctic winter had been mild, resulting in a larger amount of ice. On the morning of Sunday the 14th of April 1912, Bruce Ismay attended the church service held in the first-class dining room, where first-class passengers would sing hymns about the danger at sea. Throughout the day, Titanic received its first warning messages about ice from a number of different ships, including Cunard liner RMS Caronia and the SS Californian, as well as others. On the Sunday afternoon, Ismay was talking to passengers, Mr. and Mrs. Widener, on A deck, when the captain came along and handed him an ice warning from the Baltic, which Ismay looked at casually and absent-mindedly put in his pocket. Later on, Ismay handed the message back to Smith at about 7:10 p.m, when he was in the smoking room. Smith came in for some reason and happened to see Ismay and asked for the telegram, as he wanted to put it in the officer's chart room. In the evening of the 14th of April, Ismay dined at 7:30 p.m. with Dr. William O'Loughlin, White Star's senior surgeon, in the a la carte restaurant. O'Loughlin was a very old and dear friend of both Thomas and Bruce Ismay, and had worked with White Star for many decades. As the huge ship was approaching her final hours, most passengers had settled into their beds, and the air temperature had quickly fallen to near freezing. Captain Smith retired to his cabin, leaving First Officer Murdoch in charge of the bridge. Ismay retired to his suite at around 10:30 p.m. At the time of the collision, Bruce Ismay was sleeping in his cabin and was alerted by a sudden vibration. Thinking that the ship had lost a propeller blade, Bruce left his cabin and went into the passageway, where he met a steward, and he asked what had happened. The steward told him that he did not know. On hearing this, Bruce walked back to his cabin, put on an overcoat, and made his way to the bridge, where he found Captain Smith. Upon realising the Titanic had struck ice, Bruce asked Smith if the damage was serious. Smith replied that he was afraid so. After hearing the troubling news, he went down to the main companionway, where he met Chief Engineer Bell. Ismay asked if he thought the ship was seriously damaged, and Bell said he thought so, but was quite satisfied that the pumps would keep her afloat. Bruce then made his way back to the boat deck, where passengers were beginning to gather as preparations to load the lifeboats were underway. Initially, Bruce found himself beside lifeboat number 7, located on the starboard side. Under the supervision of First Officer Murdoch, this was the first lifeboat to be lowered from the stricken vessel. Several crew members later testified that they witnessed Bruce Ismay assisting with preparing and loading lifeboat number 7. Mr. Ismay, in the first place, was asking the gentlemen to kindly step back, as it was ladies first in the boat. After assisting in this lifeboat, Ismay made his way to starboard lifeboat number 5. He found First Officer Murdoch again in charge, and he attempted to assist in any way he could. According to a witness, Ismay called out twice in a loud voice if there were any more women before that boat left, and he assisted a stewardess jump into the lifeboat number 5. Ismay then stopped Mr. Murdoch from lowering the boat because the after end was getting hung up. When the lifeboat was carefully lowered away, Ismay got over anxious and started shouting, "Lower away, lower away, lower away," to Fifth Officer Lowe, who answered, "If you get the hell out of the way, we'll be able to do something. You want me to lower faster? You'll have me drown the lot of them." Ismay was completely stunned. On board Titanic, his position was the same as any other passenger. Having no real authority, he made no reply, turning and walking away. Bruce moved to lifeboat number 3, where he was joined soon afterwards by Officer Harold Lowe. Mr. Ismay was seeing the passengers into the lifeboat, doing all he could to assist to get that boat out. At around 1:25 a.m, as water was getting closer, the next lifeboat to be prepared for passengers was starboard side number 9. First Class Steward Edward Wheelton saw Murdoch and Ismay helping to prepare the lifeboat. Once Bruce could be of no further assistance at lifeboat 9, he progressed to lifeboats 11, 13 and 15, where he found that preparations were already well underway. Ismay then disappeared from the scene, but he was seen again when Collapsible C was being prepared. This was the lifeboat in which Bruce left the stricken vessel, the repercussions of which would stay with him for the remainder of his life. He helped get the boat to the davits, but there was no response and there were no passengers left on deck. Ismay decided to climb into the collapsible at the very last moment, when it was already being lowered away. As the boat was leaving, he could see no women or children in the vicinity. Murdoch acknowledged the fact that he was on board. Once the collapsible was lowered into the ocean, Bruce assisted with rowing, seated with his back on the ship. Despite the best efforts of Carpathia's crew, the rescue ship arrived on the scene 1.5 hours after Titanic slipped beneath the water, taking with her just over 1,500 lives. Lifeboat number 2 became the first to be rescued, with boat number 12 being the last to be recovered 4 hours later. Collapsible C, the lifeboat in which Bruce Ismay was present, was among the last lifeboats to be taken on board Carpathia. Bruce Ismay was able to climb aboard Carpathia using a Jacob's ladder. Once on board, as with all survivors, he was offered a hot drink and soup, which he repeatedly refused. Observations of Bruce made by several passengers and crew members suggested that Bruce did not appear to be in complete control of his state of mind. And this was also recognised by Carpathia's doctor, who quickly ushered Bruce to his own cabin. When he heard there were still women and children on board, he became inconsolable. To make it worse, he had just learned that his valet Richard Fry and his secretary Harrison were also missing. While on board Carpathia, Ismay was heavily criticised by some of the survivors. He had the comfort of the doctor's cabin, while others had just a blanket. The doctor asked the survivor John Jack Thayer to visit Ismay in the hope that this would help relieve his terrible condition, as the Thayer family was acquainted with Bruce Ismay. When Thayer entered the room, Ismay was sated, in his pyjamas staring straight ahead, shaking all over like a leaf. His entrance did not dawn on his consciousness. Ismay was completely wrecked, and he was left alone for the rest of the voyage. On the 17th of April, Bruce Ismay's first telegram to White Star's New York office confirming the sinking of the RMS Titanic was sent. It read, "Deeply regret. Advise you Titanic sank this morning, 15th, after collision. Iceberg, resulting serious loss of life. Further particulars later." Bruce's wife Julia, sorrowful for the huge loss of life, but also delighted by the news of her husband's survival, had been making plans to leave for New York to be with her husband. Philip Franklin, vice president of IMM, advised of Bruce's intention to leave immediately for England, and therefore the decision was made that she should wait for his return. Meanwhile, as Carpathia was heading towards New York, Senator William Alden Smith had been arranging for an inquiry to take place once the ship arrived. Fearful that Ismay, along with Titanic crew members, would make their way to England, he arranged a naval escort for Carpathia to ensure that no one left the ship before it docked. Carpathia arrived in New York on the evening of the 18th of April, where a large crowd had assembled, many seeking news of their loved ones. Soon after Carpathia docked, Ismay was visited by Philip Franklin, followed soon afterwards by Senator William Smith. The purpose of Senator Smith's visit was to officially inform Bruce Ismay that he would be required to appear before the forthcoming Senate inquiry. which was due to begin the following day. Subsequently, Bruce, along with surviving crew members, were immediately summoned to appear before the American Senate Committee, thereby confining them to American shores until the 30th of April. Ismay soon had a chance to defend himself. He was the first witness of the first day of the US Senate inquiry into the loss of the Titanic. On April 19, 1912. All those summoned to testify were keen to return home at the earliest possible moment. Consequently, at noon on the 2nd of May 1912, Bruce, along with 4 surviving officers, Frederick Fleet, and about 40 other crew members, left for England aboard the White Star liner Adriatic. While Bruce was leaving New York, the British inquiry known as the British Wreck Commissioner's Inquiry was just beginning in London. Headed by John Bingham, Lord Mersey, the inquiry would last for 2 months, with Bruce Ismay being sworn in 7 days after returning to England. Both the British and American inquiries cleared Bruce Ismay of any blame. Many American British citizens were guided only by sensationalist newspaper reports that focused on Ismay's actions while on board Titanic. Once both inquiries were finished, Bruce once again began to focus on his retirement. On the 30th of June 1913, Bruce Ismay retired from the presidency of IMM, and therefore from the chairmanship of the White Star Line. And by doing so, he lost control of the company that his father had saved from near bankruptcy some 45 years earlier. Ismay maintained an interest in maritime affairs. He inaugurated a cadet ship called Mersey used to train officers for Britain's merchant navy. Donated £11,000 to start a fund for lost seamen, and in 1919 gave £25,000 to set up a fund to recognise the contribution of merchant mariners in the First World War. Bruce, along with his wife Julia, were currently living in a large Georgian house in Mayfair, London, which provided the perfect residence while he was president of IMM. But Bruce now wished to spend more time pursuing his favourite sport, fishing, so the couple journeyed to the Scottish home of his brother Charles Bower Ismay. While staying with his brother, Bruce was told of a lodge that had recently come up for sale. The lodge was located in Costello, County Galway, Ireland, and he immediately purchased the property. On their return to London, Bruce arranged for major improvement work to be carried out during the winter, stipulating that the work should be completed ready for their return the following summer. Following the renovation work, the couple continued to share their time between Costello during the summer and their London home during the remainder of the year. Ismay was delighted when he received a letter in late November 1922 informing him that he had been selected to serve on the board of a newly formed railway company to be known as the London, Midland and Scottish Railway. He happily accepted this directorship. In the same year, Mr. and Mrs. Ismay received news that their Costello home had been burned to the ground during the Irish Civil War. Both Bruce and Julia were devastated to hear the news, but it provided them with the opportunity to completely rebuild their summer home. The replacement was much larger than the original, with many design ideas coming from Julia. The couple were delighted with their new home, which was now preferable to their Mayfair residence. But as most of Bruce's work was located in London, they continued to live in Mayfair during the winter months. Bruce and Julia loved the local community of Costello, and they were liked and respected within the village. Mr. and Mrs. Ismay spent many happy years living between Costello and London, with Bruce's business interests keeping him busy throughout his later years. At 70 years of age, just 7 years after the rebuilding of the lodge, Bruce's health began to fail. and it was now time for him to withdraw from his various directorships. He was suffering from severe pains in his legs, which began to affect his mobility. In the autumn of 1937, Mr. and Mrs. Ismay, along with their butler, travelled to Farnborough for a short break, returning to their London home in October. On the evening of the 14th, their butler had prepared a bath for Bruce. When he later returned to the bedroom, he was shocked to find Bruce unconscious in an armchair aside the bed. With assistance, he managed to move him into the bed. Bruce had suffered a massive stroke, which had taken his sight and his speech. He remained there for 3 days, during which time his wife never left his side. Bruce died soon after midday on the 17th of October 1937, without ever regaining full consciousness.